you are going to die. Not eventually, in some abstract future. The configuration of matter that you call yourself, the specific arrangement of atoms and electrical patterns that constitutes the experience of being you, is moving toward dissolution at every moment. And the dissolution is not a remote possibility, but an active process unfolding in your tissues right now. The body that reads these words is approximately 70 years from its statistical end. The brain that processes them will, at some specific moment that is approaching even as you sit reading this, stop generating the patterns of activity that produce the sensation of being you. And the question that opens the inquiry that follows is the question that every conscious being eventually has to face. What happens to you when this happens? What becomes of the information that is currently constituting your experience when the biological substrate that has been carrying that information ceases to function? The question is not metaphysical speculation in the loose sense. The question is one that contemporary neuroscience, quantum physics, and consciousness research have begun to address with experimental rigor and theoretical precision that earlier generations could not bring to bear. And what these inquiries are starting to reveal, when they are taken together with the contemplative traditions that have addressed the same question across thousands of years, is something that no honest examination can leave unspoken. The question of what happens to consciousness at death is one of the deepest questions a human being can ask, and the answers that are emerging from current investigation deserve to be examined with the seriousness that the question requires. The cellular processes that will eventually constitute your death are already underway. The mitochondria in your tissues are accumulating damage that will, at some specific point, exceed the repair mechanisms that have been protecting you. The proteins in your neurons are accumulating misfolds and aggregations that will, at some specific point, compromise the function of the cells that generate your experience. The telomeres at the ends of your chromosomes are shortening with each cell division, and the shortening will, at some specific point, trigger the senescence cascades that mark the biological end. None of this is hypothetical. All of this is happening as you read this sentence. The body that you call yourself is, in a precise biological sense, dying right now, with the dying being the consequence of cumulative cellular processes that are unfolding continuously throughout your tissues. The pace of the dying may be slow at the moment, but the direction is unambiguous. And the question of what happens when the cumulative processes finally cross the threshold that constitutes biological death is the question that the inquiry has to address. The starting point for any serious inquiry into this question is what current neuroscience has been able to document about the actual biological process of dying. The body's death is not a single moment, but a cascading sequence of failures, each with its own timing and its own consequences for the patterns of brain activity that current neuroscience associates with conscious experience. When the heart stops, blood ceases to circulate, oxygen delivery to the brain is interrupted, and the metabolic substrate that sustains neural activity begins to fail. The first measurable changes in brain function occur within seconds. The standard electroencephalogram, the recording technology that detects the electrical activity of neural populations through electrodes placed on the scalp, registers a substantial decrease in activity within the first 10 to 20 seconds of cardiac arrest. The signal does not vanish abruptly. The signal degrades through a sequence of changes that have been documented in considerable detail by researchers studying the biology of dying. A particularly important set of findings has come from the work of Jimo Borjigin and her colleagues at the University of Michigan, who in 2013 published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that documented a striking phenomenon in the brains of dying rats. Within 30 seconds of cardiac arrest, the dying brains showed a surge of high-frequency gamma-wave activity, with patterns of cross-frequency coupling that exceeded what is typically observed during normal waking consciousness. The findings suggested that the dying brain is not, as had been assumed, simply shutting down through a gradual loss of activity. The dying brain, on Borjigín's findings, generates a brief but intense burst of organized neural activity that has the signatures associated with conscious processing. The implications for the biology of dying have been pursued in subsequent research, with related findings reported in Dying Human Brains in case studies by Lakshmi Chawla in 2009 and by additional groups in subsequent years. The picture that emerges is that the moment of biological death involves a kind of paradoxical surge of consciousness associated brain activity rather than a simple cessation, and the meaning of this surge is one of the open questions that current research is working to address. Borjigín's research group extended these findings substantially in 2023, with a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that documented similar gamma-wave surges in the brains of dying human patients. The study examined 4 comatose patients who had been removed from life support with continuous electroencephalographic monitoring throughout the dying process. 2 of the patients showed substantial gamma-wave activity during the period after cardiac arrest, with the activity occurring specifically in brain regions associated with conscious processing and with patterns of cross-frequency coupling that exceeded their pre-death baseline. The findings extended the rat studies to human subjects and provided the strongest evidence to date that the human brain undergoes a paradoxical activation during the dying process, rather than the simple shutdown that earlier models had assumed. The interpretation of these findings remains contested, with some researchers arguing that the gamma surges represent a final flicker of disorganized activity rather than coherent conscious experience. But the data themselves, the specific patterns of cross-frequency coupling that the studies documented, are consistent with what neuroscience has identified as the signatures of conscious processing in living subjects, and the easy interpretation of these signatures as random noise faces serious empirical challenges. The inquiry into what happens to consciousness at death has been pursued most systematically by Sam Parnia, the cardiologist and resuscitation researcher who has, since the early 2000s, conducted some of the most carefully designed studies of consciousness during cardiac arrest. Parnia, who works at NYU Langone Health, has been the principal investigator of the AWARE studies, which have been the largest and most methodologically rigorous investigations of consciousness during clinical death conducted to date. The first AWARE study, published in 2014 the journal Resuscitation, examined cases of cardiac arrest across 15 hospitals in 3 countries. The second AWARE study, AWARE 2, was completed in 2022 and examined cases across additional hospital sites with refined methodologies. The findings have been the subject of considerable discussion in both medical and philosophical communities. What Parnia and his collaborators have documented is that a significant percentage of patients who survive cardiac arrest report subjective experiences from the period during which their hearts had stopped and their brains were, by the standard medical criteria, not generating the activity associated with consciousness. The reports include perceptions of the resuscitation procedures, perceptions of medical conversations, perceptions of locations and details that the patient should not have been able to perceive given their physical state. The patients report these experiences with subjective vividness and consistency that contrasts sharply with the absence of the brain activity that current neuroscience associates with such experiences. The reports cannot be dismissed as straightforward hallucination, because hallucinations would be expected to involve disorganized perceptual content rather than the structured and accurate perception of the actual environment that some of the reports include. Parnia's research has been careful to distinguish between several categories of report, Some reports involve visual and auditory perceptions of the resuscitation environment that can be checked against the actual circumstances. Some reports involve broader subjective experiences of an existential or transcendent character that cannot be empirically verified, but that follow consistent patterns across many cases. Some reports involve what patients describe as encounters with deceased relatives or with luminous beings or with reviews of their own lives. The categories are not mutually exclusive, and individual patients often report experiences from multiple categories. What is consistent across the reports is the subjective conviction that the experiences were real, that they occurred during the period of cardiac arrest rather than before or after, and that they were qualitatively different from ordinary dreams or hallucinations in ways that the patients can articulate, but that current neuroscience has not been able to fully account for. The AWARE-2 study, completed at NYU Langone in 2022 and published in the journal Resuscitation, advanced the methodology by adding electroencephalogram monitoring during the actual resuscitation process. The study found that approximately 40% of cardiac arrest patients showed brain activity, including activity in the gamma frequency bands associated with conscious processing during the period of resuscitation, despite the absence of cardiac function. Some of these patients reported, after recovery, subjective experiences that corresponded to specific events that occurred during the period when their cardiac function had ceased. The findings of AWARE-2 were particularly significant because they provided objective electroencephalographic evidence that brain activity was occurring during the period of clinical death, with the activity having the signatures associated with conscious processing rather than the disorganized patterns that pure physiological dysfunction would produce. Parnia and his co-investigators concluded that the standard model of consciousness ceasing immediately upon cardiac arrest needed to be revised in light of the documented evidence, and that the question of what consciousness is actually doing during this period required further investigation rather than dismissal. A complementary line of research has been pursued by Bruce Greyson, the psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who has conducted decades of investigation into near-death experiences. Greyson, who developed the standard measurement scale used in the field and who has authored hundreds of papers on the topic, has documented the consistent features of these experiences across thousands of cases collected from many different cultures and contexts. The features include the sense of separation from the physical body, the perception of moving through some kind of transition or boundary, encounters with luminous beings or with deceased persons, reviews of one's own life with vivid clarity, and the eventual return to physical embodiment with the experience having transformed the person's subsequent attitudes toward death and toward life. Greyson's work has been published in major medical and psychological journals, and his book, After, published in 2021, summarized the findings of his career-long investigation. What Greyson's research has documented, with particular care, is that near-death experiences cannot be reduced to any of the standard naturalistic explanations that have been proposed. The experiences are not hallucinations in the ordinary sense, because hallucinations do not produce the lasting transformations of personality and worldview that near-death experiences consistently produce. The experiences are not the products of oxygen deprivation, because they occur in cases where oxygen levels are not significantly compromised. The experiences are not the products of medication, because they occur in patients who have received no medications and who have not been administered the substances that some have proposed as explanations. The experiences are not products of religious or cultural expectations, because they occur with consistent features across persons of widely different religious backgrounds and across persons who had no prior beliefs about an afterlife. The experiences, on Greyson's careful analysis, constitute a phenomenon that current neuroscience has not been able to fully explain, and the implications of this fact are one of the open questions that current research is working to address. Greyson has documented in particular the long-term transformations that follow near-death experiences. The persons who report these experiences typically show measurable shifts in their attitudes toward death itself, with the fear of death substantially diminished or eliminated entirely. They show increased valuation of relationships and of the present moment, with corresponding decreases in materialistic concerns. They show increased engagement with questions about meaning and purpose, with many of them changing their occupations or their life trajectories in ways that align them with what they take to be the deeper purposes that the experience is revealed. The transformations are durable, persisting for decades after the experiences themselves, and the consistency of these transformations across thousands of documented cases is one of the features that distinguishes near-death experiences from ordinary hallucinations or dreams. Hallucinations and dreams do not produce decades-long transformations of character and worldview. The experiences during cardiac arrest do, and the implications of this fact for what the experiences actually involve are part of what current research is working to address. The findings from this body of research need to be presented with the appropriate epistemic caution. The reports of conscious experience during cardiac arrest are subjective reports, with all the limitations that attach to any subjective evidence. The standard methodological concerns about confirmation bias, about the timing of when the experiences actually occurred relative to the period of cardiac arrest, about the possibility of unconscious construction of experience after the fact, are real concerns that responsible researchers in the field take seriously. Parnia and Greyson have both addressed these concerns extensively in their published work, and the methodological rigor of the leading research is genuine. But the field remains contested, and the strongest claims that can be made on the basis of current evidence are claims about the existence of a phenomenon that current neuroscience has not been able to fully account for, rather than claims about specific metaphysical interpretations of what the phenomenon ultimately involves. What the research has established with reasonable confidence is that the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience at the time of clinical death is not the simple correspondence that earlier models assumed. The standard model, in which consciousness is generated by brain activity and ceases when brain activity ceases, does not adequately account for the documented phenomena. Either consciousness can persist briefly during the period of severely compromised brain activity through mechanisms that current neuroscience does not fully understand, or the relationship between brain activity and consciousness involves features that exceed what current measurement technologies can detect. Either possibility points toward the recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at death is not a settled question that can be answered by reciting the standard neurological account. The question remains genuinely open, and the answer that emerges from continued research will have profound implications for how human beings understand their own existence. The deeper context for these neurological findings is provided by the principles of physics that govern what happens to information in physical systems. The recognition that information is a physical quantity, with specific conservation laws that govern how it can be transformed but not destroyed, is one of the central recognitions of 20th and 21st century physics. The work of Claude Shannon, the mathematician and engineer at Bell Labs, whose 1948 paper established the foundations of information theory, articulated the mathematical framework within which information could be precisely defined and measured. The work of Rolf Landauer at IBM, in his 1961 paper on the thermodynamics of computation, established that the erasure of information necessarily involves the dissipation of energy in the form of heat, with a specific minimum amount of energy required to erase a single bit of information. The Landau principle, as it has come to be called, was experimentally confirmed in 2012 by Antoine Bérout and his collaborators at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, and the principle has become a cornerstone of how physicists think about the relationship between information and physical reality. The implication of these foundational principles for the question of consciousness at death is significant. The information that constitutes you, the specific patterns of neural activity that encode your memories and your knowledge and your sense of self, is a physical pattern that exists in a physical substrate. The question of what happens to this information when the substrate fails is not a metaphysical question that physics cannot address. The question is a physical question that has specific theoretical implications. The information cannot simply vanish in a violation of the conservation principles that govern how information behaves in physical systems. The information must either be preserved in some form, transformed into some other physical pattern, or accounted for through some specific mechanism that physics can in principle describe. The fact that current neuroscience does not yet have a complete account of what happens to the information at the moment of death is not evidence that the information disappears. The fact is evidence that the question requires further investigation, and the resources that physics provides for thinking about how information can be preserved across changes of substrate are resources that earlier generations could not bring to bear on the question. A particularly important development in this area has been the extended controversy over what happens to information that falls into a black hole. Stephen Hawking, in his 1974 paper that established that black holes radiate energy through what is now called Hawking radiation, initially argued that the radiation carries no information about what fell into the black hole. The implication on Hawking's initial position was that information could be destroyed through the process of black hole evaporation, in violation of the conservation principles that physics had assumed to be exact. The position generated decades of intense controversy, with many physicists arguing that the implication could not be correct. The eventual resolution, which Hawking himself acknowledged in 2004 with significant qualification, was that information must be preserved through black hole evaporation, with the radiation carrying back, in some highly distributed form, the information that had crossed the event horizon. The technical details of how this preservation occurs remain the subject of ongoing research, with the holographic principle and the AD-CFT correspondence providing some of the theoretical resources for understanding how information can be preserved even when the original physical pattern is dramatically transformed. The resolution of the black hole information paradox involved decades of work by physicists, including Leonard Susskind at Stanford, Gerard Hooft at Utrecht, Juan Maldacena at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and many others. The Maldacena conjecture of 1997, the ADS, CFT correspondence that relates a theory of gravity in a bulk space to a quantum field theory on its boundary, provided the most powerful theoretical framework for understanding how information could be preserved across what looked like a destructive process. The boundary theory on this framework contains all the information that is also encoded in the bulk, with the relationship between bulk and boundary being one of holographic correspondence rather than of independent existence. Information that appears, from a bulk perspective, to be lost when matter falls into a black hole is, from the boundary perspective, simply transformed into a different distribution that preserves the underlying informational content. The theoretical framework has been extended in subsequent work to suggest that the relationship between consciousness and its physical substrate may have similar holographic features, with the information that constitutes a particular conscious experience being preserved in distributed forms that exceed the local biological substrate that ordinary perception associates with the consciousness. The significance of this debate for the question of consciousness at death is structural. If the conservation of information is fundamental enough that it must apply even at the extreme conditions of black hole evaporation, then the principle has clear implications for the much more modest physical changes involved in the death of a biological organism. The information that constitutes a human consciousness is, on the physical analyses that have been worked out for analogous systems, a kind of pattern that cannot simply be destroyed, but that can be transformed into different forms while preserving the underlying informational content. What happens to this pattern when the biological substrate fails is, on the principles that have been established for other physical systems, a transformation rather than a destruction. The specific form that the transformation takes, the specific mechanisms by which the information is preserved across the transition, and the relationship between the preserved information and any continuing subjective experience are all questions that current research is working to address. But the framework within which the questions are asked is now a framework provided by rigorous physics, not by speculative metaphysics. There is a particular feature of the research on consciousness at death that deserves attention because it bears directly on the deeper questions that the inquiry will eventually have to address. The patients who report subjective experiences during cardiac arrest consistently describe these experiences as more vivid, more coherent, and more meaningful than ordinary waking experiences. This finding, which has been documented across many studies, is the opposite of what would be expected if the experiences were merely the products of compromised brain function. Compromised brain function produces fragmented, disorganized, confused, subjective content when it produces any subjective content at all. The experiences during cardiac arrest, by contrast, are reported as having greater clarity and coherence than ordinary consciousness. The reports describe a sense of being more fully aware, more deeply integrated, more authentically present than the ordinary states of consciousness from which the patients had departed. The pattern is consistent enough across the documented cases that it cannot be explained as confabulation or as the projection of cultural expectations. The pattern is part of the phenomenon that current research is trying to account for, and the implications of this pattern for how we understand the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience are significant. If consciousness during the period of compromised brain activity is more vivid and coherent than ordinary consciousness, then the brain cannot be the simple generator of consciousness that the standard model has assumed. Either consciousness has a substrate that current neuroscience has not identified, with the brain functioning in some more limited role than the role of generator, or the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience is structured in some way that current models do not capture. The contemplative traditions have, in their own different vocabularies, articulated frameworks in which the brain functions not as the generator of consciousness, but as a kind of filter or mediator through which a more fundamental consciousness becomes manifest in a particular embodied form. These traditions have specific accounts of what happens when the filter or mediator fails, and the accounts are not the simple cessation that the materialist model assumes. The convergence between the empirical findings from current research and the contemplative accounts that have been developed across thousands of years is one of the most striking convergences that the inquiry will examine. The research of Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist who conducted a major prospective study of near-death experiences in cardiac arrest survivors, contributed important methodological precision to this field. Van Lommel's study, published in The Lancet in 2001, followed 344 patients who had survived cardiac arrest across 10 Dutch hospitals. The study documented that approximately 18% of the survivors reported some form of near-death experience, with the experiences showing the consistent features that other researchers have documented. What was particularly significant about Van Lommel's study was its prospective design, which avoided the methodological concerns that had attached to retrospective studies and its careful documentation of the medical conditions of the patients during the period of clinical death. The study found that the depth and character of the near-death experiences did not correlate with the specific medical conditions, the duration of unconsciousness, or the medications received in the ways that purely physiological explanations would predict. Van Lommel's conclusions, which were the subject of considerable subsequent discussion, were that the standard reductive accounts could not adequately explain the documented phenomena, and that the relationship between brain activity and consciousness needed to be reconsidered. The pattern of evidence from this body of research, taken as a whole, suggests that the moment of biological death involves something more than the simple cessation of consciousness that earlier models assumed. The neural activity that current neuroscience associates with consciousness does not simply switch off at the moment of death. The brain shows a complex sequence of changes that includes paradoxical surges of organized activity. The patients who survive report subjective experiences from the period of clinical death that have features that resist standard physiological explanations. The information that constitutes a human consciousness is, on the physical principles that have been established for analogous systems, a pattern that cannot simply be destroyed but must be transformed while preserving the underlying informational content. The convergence of these various lines of evidence does not resolve the deepest questions about what happens to consciousness at death, but the convergence does establish that the questions are genuine and that the easy answers of the older materialist framework do not adequately address them. The contemplative traditions have, for thousands of years, addressed these questions with their own different methods and within their own different frameworks. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has developed extensive accounts of the stages of consciousness during the dying process, with detailed descriptions of what the dying person experiences and of how these experiences relate to the continuing existence of consciousness across the transition. The Christian tradition has developed accounts of the soul's continuing existence between death and the resurrection that the tradition anticipates, with substantial reflection on what this continuing existence involves. The Islamic tradition has articulated the doctrine of barzakh, the intermediate state in which consciousness exists between death and the final judgment, with specific accounts of the conditions of this state. The Hindu traditions have developed accounts of the migration of the Atman from one embodied form to another, with the migration being structured by the karmic patterns that the consciousness has accumulated. The ancient Egyptian tradition produced one of the most elaborate funerary literatures of any culture, with the text now collected as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, providing detailed instructions for the soul's journey through the post-mortem realm. The convergence of these widely separated traditions on the recognition that consciousness continues after biological death, while the specific accounts of what this continuation involves vary substantially across the traditions, is one of the features that the deeper inquiry will eventually examine. What is striking about the convergence of these traditions is not merely that they all affirm some form of continuation. What is striking is the specific structural features that recur across the different accounts. The traditions consistently describe a transitional period during which the consciousness undergoes some form of review or evaluation of its previous embodied existence. The traditions consistently describe encounters with luminous presences that the consciousness recognizes as having a deeper authority than ordinary embodied existence allows. The traditions consistently describe a process of release from particular attachments that had structured the embodied life, with this release being the condition for the consciousness to engage with what comes next. The structural features that recur across these widely separated traditions are precisely the features that contemporary near-death research has documented in its own different vocabulary, and the convergence between the traditional accounts and the empirical research is one of the most striking convergences in the entire field of consciousness studies. The traditions did not arrive at these recognitions through experimental investigation. The traditions arrived through sustained attention to the experiences of dying persons, to the testimonies of those who returned from clinical death in pre-modern contexts, to the contemplative practices that the traditions developed for engaging directly with the dying process while still embodied. And what they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, is what the contemporary research is now documenting through electroencephalography and resuscitation medicine. What the contemporary research has begun to suggest, when it is considered alongside these contemplative traditions, is that the question of what happens to consciousness at death may not be the metaphysical question that materialist frameworks have treated it as. The question may be a physical question, with answers that physics is starting to be able to formulate in terms of information conservation, of the relationship between consciousness and the physical substrate, of the mechanisms by which informational patterns can be preserved across changes of substrate. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating, in their own pre-scientific vocabularies, recognitions about the structure of reality that contemporary physics is now in a position to confirm or refine through its own different methods. The convergence is not coincidence. The convergence is the consequence of the fact that the traditions were attending carefully to features of human experience that have a real basis in the structure of consciousness and reality, even when the technical resources for articulating this basis were not yet available. The relationship between current research and the contemplative traditions is, on this reading, one of mutual illumination rather than of competition. The body that reads these words is moving toward an end that none of the inquiries can prevent. The question is not whether biological death will occur. The question is what the biological death actually accomplishes, what is preserved through the transition, and what the relationship is between the consciousness that is currently generating the experience of being you and the deeper structures of reality from which this consciousness derives. The next stage of the inquiry will examine the specific physical theories that have been developed to address these questions, with particular attention to the work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff on the quantum substrate of consciousness, and to the broader frameworks within which the preservation of information across the transition of death can be understood. The answers that emerge will not be final answers. The questions are too deep for any current investigation to settle definitively. But the answers will be more substantive than the materialist dismissals that have dominated public discussion of these questions, and they will be more rigorous than the speculative reassurances that popular spiritual literature has offered. The inquiry deserves its proper seriousness, because the questions it addresses are the deepest questions that any conscious being can ask, and you are the conscious being for whom these questions ultimately matter. The information that is currently being you cannot be destroyed. This is not a metaphysical claim. This is a consequence of the conservation laws that physics has established with mathematical precision over the past century. The patterns of activity in your brain that constitute the experience of being you, the specific configuration of electrical and chemical signals that encodes your memories and your sense of self, and the awareness that is reading these words, is a physical pattern. Physical patterns can be transformed. Physical patterns can be reorganized into different configurations. But physical patterns cannot, in the deepest principles that physics has established, simply vanish. The information that constitutes you must, when the biological substrate that has been carrying it ceases to function, go somewhere. The question is where. And the question is not a metaphysical question that lies outside the reach of rigorous investigation. The question is a physical question that contemporary research is now in a position to address with the precision that the question deserves. What follows is the examination of the specific physical theories that have been developed to address this question, and the specific implications that these theories have for what happens to the consciousness that is currently constituting your experience. The most ambitious physical theory of consciousness that has been developed to address the question of what happens at death is the orchestrated objective reduction theory, usually called OR, articulated by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff over a series of papers and books beginning in the 1990s. The theory has been the subject of substantial controversy across its history, with serious physicists holding sharply divergent views about its empirical viability. But the theory deserves careful examination because it is the most rigorous attempt to ground consciousness in quantum mechanical processes, and because its implications for what happens to consciousness at death are precise enough to be examined on their merits rather than dismissed without engagement. Roger Penrose, the Oxford mathematical physicist who shared the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on black hole formation, has been one of the most prominent voices arguing that consciousness cannot be explained within the standard framework of classical neuroscience. His argument, articulated most fully in his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, and in his 1994 book, Shadows of the Mind, draws on the Gödel incompleteness theorems to argue that human mathematical understanding involves capacities that cannot be reduced to algorithmic computation. The argument has been the subject of extensive philosophical debate, with critics including Daniel Dennett and others raising serious objections to the underlying logic. But Penrose's broader claim that consciousness involves quantum mechanical processes that exceed the classical physics of standard neural activity has motivated decades of theoretical and experimental work that has produced findings of independent interest. Stuart Hameroff, the anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, who became Penrose's principal collaborator in developing Orchor, brought to the theory a specific proposal about the biological substrate within which the quantum processes might occur. Hameroff's proposal, developed across his earlier work on the cellular biology of microtubules, was that the cytoskeletal protein structures called microtubules, which are present in every neuron and which have specific geometric properties that distinguish them from other cellular components, might function as the substrate for quantum coherent processes that contribute to consciousness. The microtubules, on Hameroff's analysis, have geometric and electrical properties that could in principle support the quantum coherent states that the broader OR framework requires. The combination of Penrose's theoretical framework and Hameroff's biological proposal produced the specific version of OR that has been the subject of subsequent investigation. The theory faced substantial early criticism, most prominently from Max Tegmark of MIT, who in 2000 published a calculation suggesting that quantum coherent states in the warm and wet environment of the brain would decohere far too quickly to be relevant for the timescales of conscious processing. Tegmark's calculation was widely cited as evidence that OR could not work, and the theory was for a period substantially marginalized in mainstream consciousness research. But subsequent work, particularly research demonstrating quantum coherent processes in biological systems at temperatures and conditions that earlier calculations had assumed would prevent such coherence, has substantially weakened the force of Tegmark's original objection. The discovery of quantum coherent processes in photosynthetic bacteria by Graham Fleming and his colleagues at Berkeley in 2007, the work of Judith Klinman at Berkeley demonstrating quantum tunneling in enzyme catalysis, and the broader emergence of quantum biology as a recognized field of inquiry, have established that biological systems can sustain quantum coherent processes under conditions that earlier physics assumed would preclude them. The implications for OR have been worked out in subsequent papers by Hameroff and collaborators, with the response to Tegmark's objections updated to incorporate the new findings about biological quantum coherence. The most recent direct test of the microtubule proposal came from the work of Gregory Botana and his colleagues at Wellesley College, who in 2024 published a study in eNeuro showing that anesthetic gases reduced delayed luminescence from microtubules. The finding was significant because it provided direct experimental evidence that microtubules are involved in the action of anesthetics, which work by selectively eliminating consciousness while preserving other neural functions. If anesthetics act on microtubules, and if anesthetics specifically eliminate consciousness, then the inference that microtubules are involved in the substrate of consciousness has substantial empirical support. The finding does not establish OR in its strongest form. Since the involvement of microtubules in consciousness could occur through classical mechanisms rather than through the specific quantum processes that OR proposes, but the finding provides a foothold for the broader theoretical framework that Penrose and Hameroff have developed, and the implications for the questions about death that the inquiry is examining are direct. If consciousness is connected to microtubule activity in the specific way that the anesthetic findings suggest, then the cessation of microtubule activity at biological death is the cessation of one specific carrier of consciousness, with the broader question of what happens to the underlying processes being one that the framework allows to be formulated with greater precision. The implication of OR for what happens to consciousness at death is specific and consequential. On the theory, consciousness is associated with the quantum coherent states in microtubules, with the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involving the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states through the gravitational mechanism that Penrose has proposed. When the brain dies, the microtubules cease to maintain the conditions that sustain quantum coherence within the neural tissue, and the local conscious processing ceases, but the quantum information that was being processed by the microtubules is not destroyed by this cessation. The information, on the theoretical framework that OR is part of, is preserved in the broader quantum state of the universe, with the local biological structures having been the means through which this information was being processed in the specific embodied form of a particular conscious experience. The death of the body terminates the specific embodied form, but the underlying quantum information that was being processed is preserved at the level of the quantum vacuum, or of whatever deeper substrate the broader physics has identified as the ground of quantum phenomena. The theory has been distinguished, with care, from the popular notion of quantum immortality that has circulated in some discussions of these topics. The notion of quantum immortality, in its various forms, claims that the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics implies that the conscious observer always survives any potentially fatal event, because there is always some branch of the wave function in which survival occurs. The notion has been seriously articulated by Max Tegmark himself in some contexts, though Tegmark has also been one of its most careful critics. The argument against quantum immortality, which Tegmark has developed in detail, is that the gradual deterioration of biological systems through aging and disease does not have the binary character that quantum branching requires. The relevant quantum events that might allow for branching survival do not generally correspond to the actual processes of biological death, which involve gradual dissolution rather than the sudden binary outcomes that quantum branching could exploit. The OR framework that Penrose and Hameroff have developed does not depend on the quantum immortality argument, and the careful articulations of the framework distinguish themselves from the immortality arguments that have circulated in less careful contexts. What OR proposes is not that consciousness survives death in the sense of continuing as the same particular embodied configuration. What OR proposes is that the quantum information that constituted a particular consciousness is preserved through the dissolution of its biological substrate, with the relationship between this preserved information and any continuing subjective experience being a separate question that the framework allows to be formulated but does not by itself resolve. This implication of Ochoa has been articulated by Hameroff in various contexts, including a widely viewed 2010 interview with Through the Wormhole and in subsequent scientific and popular discussions. Hameroff's specific framing has been that consciousness, on the Ochoa framework, is not generated by the brain, but is rather a quantum mechanical process that the brain organizes and focuses for the duration of biological existence. When the brain ceases to function, the quantum information that constituted the embodied consciousness returns to the broader quantum substrate from which it had been drawn. The framing has been criticized by some commentators as overclaiming what the theory actually establishes, and the criticism is fair to the extent that Ochoa remains a contested theory rather than an established account of consciousness. But the framing is not the speculative addition that critics have sometimes characterized it as. The framing follows directly from the structure of the theory itself, and the implications for what happens at death are part of what makes Ochoa significant for the questions the inquiry is examining. The broader physical framework within which these implications can be understood is provided by the recognition that information cannot be destroyed in physical systems. The principle of information conservation, which we considered in the earlier stages of this inquiry, applies not just to the relatively modest physical systems studied in laboratory experiments, but to all physical systems, including the systems that constitute living organisms and the information they carry. When a neural pattern that constitutes a particular memory or thought is transformed by the dissolution of its biological substrate, the information that was being carried by the pattern cannot simply vanish. The information must be transformed into some other physical form, with the conservation principles that govern information ensuring that the underlying content is preserved even when the specific pattern is dramatically reorganized. The question of what specific physical form receives the transformed information at the moment of death is one of the open questions that current research is working to address. But the principle that the information must go somewhere, that the information cannot simply disappear in violation of fundamental conservation laws, is established physics rather than speculative metaphysics. The implications of this principle for the understanding of consciousness have been pursued by various physicists working at the intersection of quantum mechanics and information theory. The work of David Chalmers, the philosopher at NYU whose 1995 paper on the hard problem of consciousness articulated the central challenge that any theory of consciousness has to address, has provided one of the most influential frameworks for thinking about how consciousness might be preserved across changes of physical substrate. Chalmers's argument is that consciousness has features, particularly the subjective qualitative character that he calls qualia, that resist reduction to standard physical processes. If this is correct, then the conservation of consciousness across physical changes is a different kind of question than the conservation of information that can be straightforwardly captured in physical descriptions. The question becomes one of how the qualitative features of subjective experience relate to the physical substrate that carries them, and of whether these qualitative features can be preserved when the physical substrate undergoes dramatic transformation. The work of Giulio Tononi, the neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin whose integrated information theory has been one of the most prominent contemporary frameworks for thinking about consciousness, provides a complementary approach. Tononi's theory, articulated across a series of papers beginning in 2004, proposes that consciousness corresponds to the integrated information that a physical system contains, with the specific quantitative measure of integration determining the specific phenomenal character of the consciousness. The implications of Tononi's framework for what happens at death are subtle. On the theory, consciousness is identical to integrated information, which means that when the integrated information of a particular system dissipates, the corresponding consciousness ceases. But the broader question of whether the integrated information that constituted a particular consciousness can be reconstituted in some other physical system, with the corresponding consciousness being recovered, is one that Tononi's framework has the resources to address, even if his published work has not pursued the question in detail. The theoretical framework allows for the possibility that consciousness might be preserved through the transformation of its physical substrate, with the preservation involving the persistence of the integrated informational structure rather than of any specific local biological pattern. A particularly important development in the broader theoretical framework has been the work on quantum entanglement and the non-local correlations that entanglement establishes between physically separated systems. The recognition that quantum entanglement allows for correlations between distant systems that cannot be explained by any local mechanism, established by the work of John Bell in 1964 and confirmed experimentally by Alan Aspect and his collaborators in 1981, and by subsequent loophole-free experiments in 2015, has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between consciousness and its physical substrate. If consciousness involves quantum-entangled processes, as Auchor and related theories suggest, then the consciousness is not strictly localized to the specific biological tissue that ordinary perception associates with it. The consciousness extends, through its entangled correlations, to the broader physical context within which the entangled processes occur. The implications of this for what happens at death are direct. The local biological substrate that ordinary perception identifies as the carrier of a particular consciousness may be only a small portion of the actual physical extent of that consciousness. The death of the local biological substrate may not be the death of the consciousness, but only the cessation of one particular embodied form through which the consciousness had been manifesting itself. The broader entangled structure within which the consciousness exists may persist beyond the death of the local biological tissue, with the relationship between the persisting structure and any continuing subjective experience being one of the central questions that current research is working to address. The framework within which these possibilities can be developed includes the work on quantum non-locality that we have considered in earlier inquiries, the recognition that quantum systems exhibit correlations that cannot be explained by any local mechanism, that the apparent locality of ordinary experience masks a deeper non-local structure that quantum mechanics has revealed, provides resources for thinking about how consciousness might be related to its biological substrate in ways that ordinary intuition does not capture. The biological substrate on this framework might be the specific local manifestation of a consciousness whose actual extent is non-local, with the death of the local substrate being the cessation of one particular manifestation rather than the destruction of the underlying non-local structure. The framework is speculative in its specific applications to consciousness, and the inquiry has to acknowledge the speculative status of these specific applications. But the framework is grounded in well-established physics rather than in metaphysical speculation, and the speculative element involves the application of established physical principles to questions about consciousness, rather than the introduction of novel principles that physics has not endorsed. The implications of the black hole information paradox for the questions about consciousness at death are particularly worth examining in detail. The paradox arose because Hawking's original calculations suggested that information falling into a black hole would be lost forever when the black hole eventually evaporated through the radiation that bears his name. The implication, on Hawking's initial position, was that information could be destroyed through a physical process in violation of the unitary evolution that quantum mechanics requires. The paradox was not resolved quickly. The resolution required decades of theoretical work involving some of the most distinguished physicists of the past half-century. What the resolution eventually established, with substantial confidence, though not yet with full rigor, was that information must indeed be preserved through black hole evaporation, with the radiation carrying back the information about what fell in through subtle correlations and entanglements that early calculations had missed. The key insight was that the apparent locality of ordinary physical processes masks a deeper, non-local structure within which information can be preserved even when the local physical configuration is dramatically transformed. The structural parallel between this resolution and the questions about consciousness at death is direct. The death of a biological organism involves a dramatic transformation of the local physical configuration that had been carrying the consciousness. But if the underlying structure of physical reality preserves information through such transformations through the kinds of mechanisms that resolve the black hole paradox, then the information that constituted the particular consciousness can be preserved even when the local biological pattern is dissolved. The mechanisms for this preservation in the case of consciousness remain to be fully characterized, but the principle that such preservation must occur is established physics, and the implications for what happens at death follow directly from the principle. The work of Yakir Aharonov and his collaborators on the time-symmetric formulation of quantum mechanics provides another set of theoretical resources that bear on the questions about consciousness at death. Aharonov, the Israeli-American physicist, whose work on the Aharonov-Bohm effect and on retrocausal aspects of quantum mechanics has been some of the most influential of the past several decades, has developed frameworks within which quantum systems are understood as being shaped not only by their past states, but also by their future states. The two-state vector formalism, articulated by Aharonov and his colleagues across many papers, treats quantum systems as being constrained by both initial and final boundary conditions, with the present state of the system being determined by the joint constraints of past and future. The implications of this framework for consciousness are substantial. If the quantum systems that constitute conscious experience are shaped not only by their past but also by their future, then the relationship between a particular conscious experience and the broader temporal structure of reality is more complex than ordinary intuition suggests. The death of a particular biological substrate on this framework is not the simple temporal endpoint that ordinary intuition treats it as. The death is one boundary condition that constrains the broader quantum process within which the consciousness has been manifesting, with the other boundary condition being the future state toward which the process is moving. The relationship between these boundary conditions and any continuing subjective experience is one of the open questions that the framework allows to be formulated with appropriate precision. There is a particular framework within consciousness studies that deserves explicit examination because it has been the subject of considerable attention in popular discussions, and because it has features that the inquiry needs to engage with carefully. The framework, sometimes called the filtering or transmission theory of consciousness, was articulated most influentially by William James in his 1898 Ingersoll lecture at Harvard, and later by Aldous Huxley in his 1954 book, The Doors of Perception. The theory proposes that the brain functions not as the generator of consciousness but as a kind of filter or reducing valve that selects, from a broader field of consciousness, the specific subset of conscious content that becomes available to the embodied person. On this framework, consciousness is not produced by the brain but is rather a more fundamental feature of reality that the brain organizes and focuses for the specific purposes of biological existence. The filtering theory has substantial appeal in connection with the questions about death that this inquiry is examining, because the theory has direct implications for what happens when the filtering apparatus ceases to function. If the brain is a filter rather than a generator, then the cessation of filtering does not eliminate consciousness, but rather releases the consciousness from the specific filtering constraints that biological existence had imposed. The death of the brain on this framework would correspond to the consciousness becoming unfiltered rather than ceasing, with the previously filtered content becoming available without the constraints that the biological apparatus had been imposing. The framework has obvious appeal for those who find the materialist account of consciousness inadequate, and the framework has been developed in various forms by contemporary thinkers, including Bernardo Kastrup and others. The framework deserves careful engagement, but the engagement has to acknowledge the substantial difficulties that the framework faces. The first difficulty is empirical. The filtering theory predicts specific patterns of brain activity that would distinguish brains that are functioning as filters from brains that are functioning as generators, but no clear empirical signature distinguishing the two possibilities has been identified. The standard neural correlates of consciousness, the patterns of brain activity that current neuroscience has documented as accompanying various conscious states, can be interpreted equally well within the generator framework and within the filtering framework. The empirical evidence does not, at present, distinguish between the two interpretations, and the filtering framework cannot claim direct empirical support that the generator framework lacks. The second difficulty is conceptual. The filtering theory requires that there be some broader field of consciousness that the brain is filtering, and the nature of this broader field is not clearly specified by the theory. If the broader field is itself a physical phenomenon, then the question of what generates the broader field becomes the new version of the original problem, with the filtering theory having merely pushed the problem one level back, rather than solving it. If the broader field is non-physical, then the theory is no longer a physical theory of consciousness, but a metaphysical theory that has its own substantial difficulties. The conceptual challenges that the filtering theory faces are not insurmountable, but they are real challenges that any responsible engagement with the theory has to acknowledge. The third difficulty is the relationship between the filtering theory and the actual contemplative traditions that have addressed similar questions. The traditions have, in their own different vocabularies, articulated frameworks that have features in common with the filtering theory, but the traditions have also articulated specific accounts of what happens at death that involve much more than the simple removal of filtering constraints. The traditions describe specific transitions, specific encounters, specific stages of the post-mortem journey that exceed what the filtering theory in its standard formulations is equipped to address. The filtering theory may be a useful first approximation to what the traditions have articulated in more elaborate detail, but the theory should not be confused with the full account that the traditions have provided. The honest position with respect to the filtering theory is that it is a serious framework that deserves continued investigation, that it has genuine appeal in connection with the questions about death that the inquiry is examining, and that it has significant difficulties that prevent it from being established as the correct account of consciousness on the basis of current evidence. The theory is one of several frameworks within which the relationship between consciousness and brain can be understood, and the question of which framework is correct remains open. What the inquiry can establish is that the standard generator model, in which consciousness is simply produced by brain activity and ceases when brain activity ceases, faces substantial difficulties that have been documented in current research. The alternatives to the generator model, including the filtering theory and the various quantum theories of consciousness, are alternatives that the field is actively investigating, and the resolution of which alternative is correct will require continued empirical and theoretical work. What can be said with reasonable confidence on the basis of the convergent evidence from multiple lines of inquiry, is that the relationship between consciousness and its biological substrate is more complex than the standard materialist framework has assumed. The neural activity that current neuroscience has documented in the brains of dying patients does not match what the standard framework predicts. The subjective experiences that patients report during clinical death have features that resist reduction to standard physiological processes. The information that constitutes a human consciousness is, on the principles that have been established for analogous physical systems, a pattern that cannot simply be destroyed, but that must be transformed while preserving the underlying informational content. The quantum theories of consciousness that Penrose and Hameroff have developed provide specific theoretical resources for understanding how this preservation might occur. And the broader frameworks within which consciousness is understood as a non-local phenomenon rather than as a strictly localized biological process provide additional resources for thinking about what happens when the local biological substrate ceases to function. The convergence of these various lines of evidence and theoretical development does not settle the deepest questions, but the convergence does establish that the questions are genuine and that the materialist dismissal of them does not adequately address the considerations involved. The deepest framework within which these questions can be understood may require recognizing that consciousness is not reducible to any specific physical substrate, but is rather a fundamental feature of reality that manifests in particular physical configurations under particular conditions. The position has been articulated in various forms by philosophers including Galen Strawson and David Chalmers, and the position is sometimes called panpsychism or proto-panpsychism. The position is controversial within contemporary philosophy of mind, but it has substantial support among serious philosophers, and the position has features that bear on the questions about death that the inquiry is examining. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then the death of a particular biological substrate does not eliminate consciousness, but rather terminates one particular configuration through which consciousness had been manifesting. The broader consciousness from which the particular configuration had been drawn persists, with the relationship between this persisting consciousness and any continuing subjective experience being part of what the inquiry will eventually have to address. Strawson's particular version of the position, articulated across his philosophical writings of the past several decades, is that consciousness must be a fundamental feature of physical reality because it cannot plausibly emerge from a base that lacks any consciousness whatsoever. The argument is that emergence in the strong sense, in which something genuinely new comes into existence from a base that does not contain it in any form, faces serious philosophical difficulties when applied to consciousness. The alternative is to recognize that consciousness, in some form, however attenuated, is present at the most basic level of physical reality, with the elaborate consciousness that human beings experience being a particular configuration of this more basic consciousness, rather than something that emerged from a wholly unconscious base. The implications for what happens at death are direct on Strawson's framework. The basic consciousness that was being configured by the human biological substrate is not eliminated by the dissolution of the substrate. The basic consciousness persists in whatever its more elementary forms are, with the specific human configuration being one particular pattern that this basic consciousness had been taking. The dissolution of the pattern is not the dissolution of the consciousness that was being configured by the pattern, even if the specific subjective experience that was associated with the configuration may not persist in its original form. The convergence of contemporary research in physics, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind on the recognition that the standard materialist framework does not adequately account for the phenomena documented in current investigation is one of the most significant developments in consciousness studies of the past several decades. The convergence does not establish any specific alternative to the materialist framework as the correct account. The convergence establishes that the materialist framework is inadequate and that the alternative frameworks deserve continued serious investigation. The implications of this convergence for the questions about death that the inquiry is examining are substantial. The death of the body does not, on the convergent picture that is emerging, terminate consciousness in the simple way that the materialist framework had assumed. The death involves the cessation of one particular embodied configuration, with the underlying consciousness being preserved through mechanisms that current research is working to characterize. The specific form of this preservation, the specific relationship between the preserved consciousness and any continuing subjective experience, are questions that the next stage of the inquiry will examine through the contemplative traditions that have addressed these questions across thousands of years. What the contemplative traditions have articulated in their own different vocabularies and within their own different frameworks is recognitions about the structure of consciousness and its relationship to the broader reality that contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. The traditions did not arrive at these recognitions through experimental investigation in the modern sense. The traditions arrived through sustained attention to the experiences of dying persons, to the contemplative practices that engage directly with the dying process while still embodied, to the philosophical reflections on what death actually involves and what it cannot involve, and what they recognized, in their own different vocabularies, has substantial structural parallel with what contemporary research is documenting through electroencephalography and resuscitation medicine and quantum information theory. The next stage of the inquiry will examine these traditional articulations in detail, with the recognition that the traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and that the convergence between them is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about what happens at death. Long before any laboratory could measure brain activity during cardiac arrest, before any mathematical framework existed for thinking about quantum information conservation or holographic preservation of physical patterns, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally parallel pictures of what happens to consciousness when the biological body ceases to function. The methods used were not measurement and theory in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to the experiences of dying persons, careful documentation of testimonies from those who returned from the threshold of death in pre-modern contexts, and contemplative practices that engaged directly with the dying process while the practitioner was still embodied. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that the moment of biological death is not the cessation of consciousness, but a transition into a different mode of existence whose specific features the traditions work to characterize with substantial precision. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human inquiry, and the deeper inquiry that follows requires careful engagement with what each major tradition has articulated about what awaits the consciousness when the body that has been carrying it gives way. The most theologically developed articulation of what happens after death in the Western religious traditions appears in Christianity, where the question has been the subject of 2,000 years of sustained reflection across philosophical, mystical, and dogmatic theological frameworks. The foundational text is the New Testament, particularly the writings of the Apostle Paul, whose first letter to the church in Corinth contains what has become one of the most influential treatments of post-mortem existence in the entire tradition. The 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, written in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, addresses the question of what happens to the human person after biological death with a precision and confidence that has shaped Christian theology across the centuries since. Paul argues in this chapter that the body that is buried is not the body that is raised. The body that is buried is, in his Greek terminology, a soma psychikon, a natural or animal body, perishable and subject to dissolution. The body that is raised is a soma pneumatikon, a spiritual body, imperishable and adapted to a different mode of existence than the embodied life that biological death terminates. The transformation between these two modes is, on Paul's articulation, fundamental enough that the resurrected existence is not the simple continuation of the previous biological life, but a genuinely new mode of being that preserves the personal identity of the deceased while transforming the physical substrate within which the identity is expressed. The Pauline framework was developed across subsequent Christian theological reflection with substantial precision. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, addressed the question in his enormous work De Civitate Dei, the treatise on the city of God whose composition occupied him for over a decade. Augustine argued that the soul continues in conscious existence after the death of the body, with the specific conditions of this continuing existence depending on the moral and spiritual state of the person at the moment of death. The conscious existence between biological death and the eventual resurrection is a real existence. On Augustine's analysis, with the soul retaining its faculties and continuing to be the subject of experience even in the absence of the body that had been its vehicle during embodied life. Augustine's articulation has been the foundation for most subsequent Christian thinking about the intermediate state, and its specific features have been developed in different directions by the various branches of the Christian tradition. The Eastern Orthodox tradition has articulated the doctrine of the soul's continuing existence in particularly elaborate form, with specific attention to the experiences that the soul undergoes after biological death. The doctrine of the toll houses, articulated in various Eastern Orthodox texts, and developed in the work of Seraphim Rose and other modern Orthodox writers, describes a sequence of encounters that the soul has with various spiritual realities during the period immediately following death. The encounters involve, on the traditional articulations, a process of evaluation and accountability for the actions and dispositions that characterize the embodied life, with the eventual outcome being determined by the relationships that the soul has cultivated during its time in the body. The doctrine has been controversial within Orthodoxy itself, with substantial debate about how literally the toll house imagery should be taken. But the underlying recognition that the soul undergoes some form of evaluative encounter during the period immediately following death is one that the Eastern tradition has articulated with particular care. The Eastern tradition has also developed the doctrine of theosis, the transformation of the human person through participation in the divine life, in ways that bear directly on the question of post-mortem existence. The doctrine, articulated by figures including Athanasius of Alexandria in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor in the 7th century, and Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, holds that the ultimate destiny of the human person is union with God through participation in the divine energies. The transformation is not the elimination of human nature, but the perfection of human nature through its participation in the divine life. The post-mortem existence of the soul, on the Eastern framework, is the continuation of this process of transformation that began during embodied life. The soul that has cultivated the relationship with the divine during embodied life continues this cultivation in the post-mortem state, with the eventual resurrection being the completion of the transformation rather than its beginning. A particular feature of the New Testament articulation of post-mortem existence appears in the Gospel of Luke, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus tells in the 16th chapter. The parable describes the post-mortem existence of two persons whose embodied lives had been radically different, with the rich man finding himself in conditions of distress and Lazarus finding himself in conditions of comfort. The specific imagery of the parable, including the description of conscious experience, of communication, and of the impossibility of crossing between the two states, has been the foundation for substantial Christian theological reflection on the conditions of the intermediate state. The first letter of Peter contains additional material in its 3rd and 4th chapters, with the controversial passages describing Christ's preaching to the spirits in prison and the gospel being preached to the dead. The interpretation of these passages has varied across the Christian tradition, with different traditions developing different accounts of what the passages describe. But the basic recognition that consciousness persists in some form between biological death and resurrection is one that the New Testament texts establish and that the subsequent tradition has developed. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican theologian whose Summa Theologiae has been one of the most influential theological works in the history of Western Christianity, addressed the question of post-mortem existence with characteristic philosophical precision. Aquinas argued that the soul, which he understood through the Aristotelian framework as the form of the body, continues in existence after the dissolution of the body, with the specific conditions of this continuing existence being determined by the relationship between the soul and the divine reality that the soul has cultivated during embodied life. The continuing existence is, on Aquinas' analysis, a genuine existence, but it is an incomplete existence because the soul is naturally oriented toward embodiment, and the disembodied state is a kind of waiting for the eventual resurrection that the tradition anticipates. The Thomistic framework has been the foundation for Catholic theology of post-mortem existence across the subsequent centuries, with Vatican II and contemporary Catholic theologians continuing to develop its implications. The doctrine of the resurrection that the various Christian traditions affirm involves a particular framework for thinking about the relationship between continuing personal identity and the dissolution of the biological substrate. The resurrection is not, on the careful Christian articulations, the resuscitation of the same biological body that died. The resurrection is the transformation of the deceased person into a new mode of embodiment that preserves the personal identity while fundamentally transforming the physical conditions of existence. The Pauline distinction between the natural body and the spiritual body captures the essential point, and the various Christian traditions have developed the distinction in their own different ways. What is consistent across the traditions is the recognition that biological death does not eliminate the person whose body has died, that some form of continuing existence persists between death and resurrection, and that the eventual outcome is a transformation that exceeds what the original biological existence had permitted. The mystical tradition within Christianity has articulated additional dimensions of these questions through its own different vocabularies. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Dominican mystic whose German sermons articulated some of the most profound mystical theology in the entire tradition, addressed the question of death in the context of his broader teaching about the relationship between the soul and the divine reality. Eckhart taught that the deepest part of the soul, what he called the Funkelin or little spark, is itself uncreated and shares in the eternity of the divine. The death of the body is, on Eckhart's analysis, the dissolution of the temporal and material aspects of the human person, with the deepest aspect of the soul being preserved through the transition because it was never strictly part of the temporal order in the first place. The framework has been the subject of considerable theological controversy across the centuries, with some of Eckhart's specific articulations being condemned by Pope John XXVIII in 1329. But the underlying intuition that the deepest aspect of the human person participates in a reality that exceeds the temporal conditions of embodied existence has been one of the persistent themes within Christian mystical theology. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has produced what is arguably the most elaborate and detailed account of the dying process and the post-mortem existence that any culture has articulated. The text known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, whose actual title is the Bardo Thodol, was composed in the 8th century of the Common Era and attributed to the legendary figure of Padmasambhava, the Indian master who is traditionally credited with bringing Buddhism to Tibet. The text was concealed by Padmasambhava and his consort Yeshi Tsogyal as a terma, a hidden treasure to be discovered at the appropriate later time, and was rediscovered in the 14th century by the treasure revealer Karma Lingpa. The text was first translated into English by Walter Evans Wentz in 1927, and subsequent translations by Robert Thurman, Francesca Fremantle, and Chogyam Trungpa and Gyurme Dorje have made its specific articulations available to readers outside the Tibetan tradition. The Bardo Thodol describes the dying process and the post-mortem existence in terms of a sequence of bardos, intermediate states, whose specific features the text characterizes with considerable precision. The first bardo is the Chikai bardo, the bardo of the moment of death itself, during which the consciousness of the dying person undergoes a sequence of dissolutions as the various elements that have constituted the embodied existence give way. The earth element, associated with the solidity of the body, dissolves first, with the dying person experiencing a sense of pressure and heaviness. The water element, associated with the fluids of the body, dissolves next, with the dying person experiencing dryness. The fire element, associated with the warmth of the body, dissolves third, with the dying person experiencing coldness. The wind element, associated with the breath, dissolves fourth, with the breathing becoming irregular and eventually ceasing. After the dissolution of these elements, the consciousness encounters what the text calls the clear light of pure being, a luminous reality that is the most fundamental ground of all existence, and that the consciousness has the opportunity to recognize as its own deepest nature. The recognition of the clear light at the moment of death is, in the Tibetan tradition, the supreme opportunity for liberation from the cycle of birth and death. If the dying consciousness can recognize the clear light as its own deepest nature, the cycle of conditioned existence comes to an end, and the consciousness enters into the unconditioned freedom that the tradition calls liberation. Most consciousnesses, on the traditional account, fail to recognize the clear light because of their long habituation to identifying themselves with the contents of conditioned experience, rather than with the underlying ground from which all experience arises. The failure of recognition leads to the second bardo, the Shonyid bardo, during which the consciousness encounters the appearances of various peaceful and wrathful deities. The deities, on the traditional teaching, are not external beings that the consciousness encounters as objects. The deities are the projections of the consciousness's own mental contents, manifesting as luminous forms whose specific characters reflect the karmic patterns that the consciousness has accumulated. The encounter with these projections is another opportunity for liberation, and another opportunity that most consciousnesses fail to take because they fail to recognize the deities as their own projections. The third bardo is the Sidpa bardo, the bardo of becoming, during which the consciousness moves toward the next embodiment. The specific embodiment is determined, on the traditional teaching, by the karmic patterns that the consciousness has accumulated, with the patterns drawing the consciousness toward the conditions that match its accumulated tendencies. The consciousness experiences the Sidpar Bardo as a series of visions and experiences that lead it toward the parents and the circumstances of its next birth, with the period of this bardo lasting up to 49 days according to the traditional teachings. The eventual entry into the next embodiment is the conclusion of the post-mortem journey for that particular consciousness, with the cycle then resuming in the new embodied form. The Bardo Thodol has been the subject of particular interest from Western readers and from researchers working on the questions about consciousness at death that have been the subject of contemporary investigation. The structural features that the text describes, the dissolution of elements, the encounter with luminous reality, the journey through stages of evaluation and projection, have substantial parallels with what contemporary near-death research has documented. The parallels are not coincidence on any plausible reading of the evidence. The traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and the convergence between them is one of the features that makes the inquiry so significant. The Islamic tradition has articulated the doctrine of barzakh, the intermediate state in which consciousness exists between biological death and the final judgment that the tradition anticipates. The Quran refers to barzakh in several passages, most directly in the 23rd surah at verse 100, where the dying person is described as expressing a wish to return to the world, to do good, and is told that there is a barzakh between them and the time when they will be raised. The Arabic word barzakh literally means a barrier or partition, and the term has been developed in Islamic theology and mysticism to describe the specific conditions of consciousness during the period between physical death and resurrection. The tradition has articulated the experiences of the soul in barzakh with substantial detail, including the specific encounters that occur during the period immediately following death. The Hadith literature, the body of traditions about the words and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, contains extensive material on what happens to the soul after death. The traditions describe the questioning of the soul by the angels Munkar and Nakir during the period immediately following burial, with the specific questions concerning the deceased person's relationship to God and to the religious community. The answers that the soul gives, which reflect the dispositions that the person cultivated during embodied life, determine the conditions of the soul's continuing existence in barzakh. The conditions can be either pleasant, with the soul experiencing the foretaste of paradise, or distressing, with the soul experiencing the foretaste of judgment. The tradition has been understood by some Muslim thinkers as primarily symbolic, and by others as describing literal experiences that the soul actually undergoes, with the question of how to interpret the specific imagery being one of the ongoing topics of Islamic theological reflection. The Sufi mystical tradition within Islam has developed the doctrine of barzakh in particularly elaborate form, with the framework being extended into a comprehensive metaphysics of the soul's journey across multiple worlds. Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian Sufi master, whose work has been the foundation of much subsequent Islamic mystical theology, articulated the doctrine of multiple barzakhs, intermediate worlds that mediate between different levels of reality. The journey of the soul, on Ibn Arabi's framework, is not a single transition from embodied life to a single intermediate state, but a sequence of transitions through multiple intermediate states whose specific characters are determined by the spiritual condition of the soul at each stage. The framework has been developed by subsequent Sufi thinkers, including Mullah Sadra, the 17th century Iranian philosopher, whose synthesis of Avicennian, Suhrawardian, and Ibn Arabian thought produced what is sometimes called the transcendent theosophy. A particular emphasis within the Sufi tradition concerns what is called al-Maut, al-Asghar, the smaller death, which the tradition contrasts with al-Maut, al-Akbar, the greater death of biological dissolution. The smaller death is the death that the Sufi practitioner cultivates during embodied life through contemplative practice, the dying to the false self that allows the deeper reality of the soul to become manifest. The smaller death is a preparation for the greater death, and the practice of dying before you die, as the tradition has articulated it through the famous hadith Mutu Qobla and Tamutu, allows the practitioner to encounter the deeper reality of the soul under conditions where the encounter can be integrated with continuing, embodied existence. The framework has substantial parallels with the Tibetan teachings about preparation for death through contemplative practice, and the convergence between the two traditions on the recognition that the dying process can be engaged consciously while still embodied is one of the structural parallels that the inquiry will eventually examine. The Quranic descriptions of barzakh and the subsequent state of resurrection contain considerable detail about the conditions of the soul during the various stages of its post-mortem journey. The 39th surah, at verse 42, articulates a particular feature of the Islamic understanding of consciousness and death that bears directly on the questions the inquiry has been examining. The verse states that God takes the souls at the time of their death and the souls of those who do not die during their sleep, holding back the souls of those for whom death has been decreed, and sending the others back until a stated term. The description suggests a structural parallel between the experience of sleep and the experience of death, with both involving a temporary or permanent separation of the soul from the body. The parallel has been the subject of considerable Islamic theological reflection, with the recognition that the soul's nightly separation from the body during sleep provides a model for understanding what occurs at the more definitive separation of biological death. The doctrine of the Kaaba, the period in the grave, articulates the conditions of the soul during the period immediately following burial in considerable detail. The traditions describe the questioning by Munkar and Nakir as occurring within the grave, with the soul experiencing the conditions of the grave as either the foretaste of paradise or the foretaste of judgment, depending on the answers given to the angel's questions. The framework has been developed in different ways across the various schools of Islamic thought, with the Sufi tradition emphasizing the experiential and transformational aspects of the Kaaba, while the more juridical traditions have emphasized the doctrinal and legal aspects. What is consistent across the Islamic articulations is the recognition that the soul retains conscious experience throughout the period of barzakh, that this experience is shaped by the dispositions cultivated during embodied life, and that the eventual resurrection at the end of time is the completion of a process whose intermediate stages the soul actively undergoes. The Hindu traditions have articulated the doctrine of the migration of the Atman, the deepest self, from one embodied form to another across multiple lifetimes. The Bhagavad Gita, in its second chapter, contains one of the most influential articulations of this teaching, with Krishna's instruction to Arjuna that the Atman is unborn and undying, that it does not perish when the body perishes, and that it moves from one body to another, as a person moves from one set of clothes to another. The framework has been developed across the subsequent Hindu philosophical traditions with substantial precision, with different schools articulating different specific accounts of how the migration occurs and what determines the specific conditions of each successive embodiment. The general framework, in which the Atman persists across the dissolution of particular bodies and migrates toward conditions that match the karmic patterns it has accumulated, is shared across the major Hindu schools, with the differences being in the specific details of how the migration is understood. The Garuda Purana, one of the major Puranic texts of the Hindu tradition, contains an extensive treatment of what happens to the soul after death, with detailed descriptions of the journey through various post-mortem realms and of the eventual conditions that determine the next embodiment, The text describes the experiences of the soul during the period immediately following death, the encounters with the messengers of Yama, the Lord of Death, and the journey to the realm of judgment, where the karmic record of the soul is examined. The specific imagery of the text has been the subject of various interpretations across the Hindu tradition, with some readers taking the imagery literally and others understanding it as symbolic representation of psychological and spiritual realities. Shankara, the 8th century philosopher who systematized Advaita Vedanta in his commentaries on the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras, addressed the question of post-mortem existence within his broader framework of non-dualistic metaphysics. The deepest reality, on Shankara's analysis, is Brahman, the absolute unity from which the manifold appearances of the manifest world derive. The Atman, the deepest self of the individual, is identical with Brahman at the deepest level, with the apparent distinction between the individual self and the absolute being a feature of the empirical reality that moksha, the liberation that the tradition aims at, eventually transcends. The death of the body is, on this framework, the dissolution of one particular configuration through which the Atman has been manifesting in the empirical world. The Atman itself is not affected by this dissolution because the Atman is identical with the eternal Brahman that exceeds all temporal configurations. The continuing existence of the Atman after death is, on this framework, not the existence of a separate individual self in some other realm, but the persistence of the universal reality that had been temporarily configured as the particular individual. The ancient Egyptian tradition produced one of the most elaborate funerary literatures of any culture, with the texts now collected as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, providing detailed instructions for the soul's journey through the post-mortem realm. The collection of texts, whose actual title in ancient Egyptian was the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was developed across more than 1,000 years of Egyptian religious tradition, with the various papyri and tomb inscriptions reflecting different periods and different theological emphases within the broader tradition. The texts describe the journey of the deceased through the duat, the underworld realm where the soul encounters various trials and judgments, with the eventual outcome being determined by the deceased's success in navigating these trials and demonstrating the worthiness of the soul. The most famous element of the Egyptian funerary tradition is the weighing of the heart, in which the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess representing truth and cosmic order. If the heart is lighter than or equal to the feather, the deceased is judged worthy and continues into the realm of Osiris, the god of the dead and the resurrection. If the heart is heavier than the feather, indicating the accumulated weight of unworthy actions during embodied life, the heart is consumed by Amit, the devourer, and the deceased ceases to exist as a coherent person. The framework has substantial parallels with the evaluative encounters that other traditions describe, with the specific Egyptian imagery being one of the earliest articulations of the structural pattern that recurs across multiple traditions. The Egyptian tradition articulated a complex anthropology in which the human person was understood to consist of multiple distinct components. The Ka was the vital force that animated the body during embodied life, and that required continued sustenance after death through the offerings made at the tomb. The Ba was the personality or soul that could move between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, often depicted as a bird with a human head. The Akh was the transformed and glorified form of the deceased that resulted from the successful navigation of the post-mortem journey, the ultimate destination of the spiritual development that the funerary tradition was designed to support. The differentiation of these various components allowed the Egyptian tradition to articulate, with considerable precision, what specifically continues after death, what specifically transforms, and what specifically requires continued ritual support from the living. The Taoist tradition of China has its own articulated framework for what happens to consciousness after biological death. The framework is grounded in the broader Taoist understanding of the relationship between the individual existence and the Tao, the underlying way or pattern that constitutes the deepest reality. Death is, on the Taoist framework, the return of the individual existence to the Tao from which it had temporarily emerged. The framework does not emphasize the persistence of individual identity in the way that the other traditions we have considered do, but it does articulate the recognition that biological death is not the cessation of existence, but a transformation back into the deeper substrate from which the individual existence had been drawn. The Taoist alchemical tradition developed practices designed to prepare the practitioner for the dissolution at death, with the cultivation of internal alchemical processes during embodied life being understood as the preparation for the transformation that death involves. The Jewish tradition has articulated the doctrine of Olam Haba, the world to come, in which the soul continues to exist after biological death. The doctrine has been developed in different ways across the different streams of Jewish tradition, with significant differences between the rabbinic, Kabbalistic, and modern Jewish articulations. The Kabbalistic tradition has produced particularly elaborate accounts of the soul's journey after death, with the doctrine of Gilgul, the transmigration of souls, providing a framework that has substantial parallels with the Hindu and Buddhist accounts of rebirth. The doctrine was developed in the Zohar and in the subsequent Kabbalistic literature, with Isaac Luria and his students developing it into a comprehensive framework for understanding the soul's relationship to its multiple embodiments across the broader cosmic process. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context, theological commitment, and specific imagery, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what contemporary research has begun to document about consciousness at death. The traditions consistently describe a transitional period during which the consciousness undergoes some form of evaluation or review of its embodied existence. The traditions consistently describe encounters with luminous presences or with transformed realities that the consciousness recognizes as having a deeper authority than ordinary embodied existence allowed. The traditions consistently describe a process of release from particular attachments that had structured the embodied life, with this release being the condition for the consciousness to engage with what comes next. The traditions consistently describe the persistence of consciousness across the dissolution of the biological substrate, with the specific conditions of this persistence being determined by the spiritual and moral patterns that the consciousness had cultivated during embodied life. And the traditions consistently describe the relationship between the post-mortem existence and the deeper reality from which all existence derives, with the specific conditions of post-mortem existence being aspects of how this deeper reality manifests in the case of the particular consciousness. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian doctrine of the resurrection is not the Tibetan doctrine, of the Bardos is not the Islamic doctrine, of Barzakh is not the Hindu doctrine, of Atman migration is not the Egyptian journey through the Duat, is not the Taoist return. To the Tao is not the Jewish doctrine of Olam Haba. Each tradition is doing its own work with its own commitments in its own context. The vocabularies differ. The metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. The specific accounts of what awaits the consciousness vary substantially across the traditions in ways that careful engagement has to acknowledge. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that consciousness persists across biological death, that the persistence has specific structural features that the traditions work to characterize, and that the engagement with the dying process during embodied life is one of the central concerns of human existence. And contemporary research, working from entirely different premises and using entirely different methods, has begun to arrive at a structurally parallel recognition through its own roots. The consciousness that is currently constituting your experience is not eliminated when the biological substrate that has been carrying it ceases to function. The transition is real, the continuation is real, and the question of what specific form the continuation takes, what specific features the transition has, and how the consciousness that is currently you can prepare for the encounter that lies ahead, is the question that the final inquiry will pursue. You are not what dies. The biological body that reads these words will, at some specific moment that approaches whether you attend to it or not, cease to function in the way that has been carrying your conscious experience throughout the years of your embodied existence. The cessation will be real. The body will be lowered into the earth or reduced to ash, depending on the funerary practices of the culture into which you were born. The persons who have known you will gather to mark the end of the embodied life that they have been participating in with you across the years. None of this is in question. What is in question? What has been the subject of the inquiry that brings us to this point is whether the cessation of the biological body is the cessation of you, or whether the cessation is the transformation of you from one mode of existence into another mode whose specific features have been the subject of careful investigation across multiple traditions and across the contemporary research that has begun to engage these questions with the seriousness they require. The synthesis that follows draws together the various strands of the inquiry. The synthesis is not the final word on questions that remain genuinely open. The synthesis is the recognition of what the convergent evidence suggests, of what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and of what specific implications follow for how a person can inhabit the biological existence whose end is the question that the inquiry has been pursuing. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist position that has been the dominant framework in mainstream neuroscience for the past several decades. The position holds that consciousness is generated by brain activity, that the cessation of brain activity at biological death is the cessation of consciousness, and that the apparent phenomena of near-death experiences and of conscious activity during cardiac arrest can be accounted for through standard neurological mechanisms that do not require any extension of the materialist framework. The position has been articulated by serious researchers, including Stephen Novella, the neurologist at Yale who has been a prominent skeptical voice on these questions, and by various other neuroscientists and philosophers who have argued that the apparent phenomena documented in current research can be explained through the physiology of dying brains, rather than through any continuing existence of consciousness. The materialist arguments deserve careful engagement. The arguments include the claim that the gamma wave surges documented in dying brains represent disorganized terminal activity rather than coherent conscious processing, the claim that near-death experiences can be reproduced through electrical stimulation of specific brain regions and through certain drug administrations, and the claim that the consistent features of near-death experiences across cultures can be explained through the common neurological architecture of human brains, rather than through any continuing reality that the experiences would otherwise represent. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist objections cannot be summarily dismissed. The neurological mechanisms that the materialist framework proposes are real mechanisms, and they do account for some of the documented phenomena under some conditions. The question is whether they account for all of the phenomena, and the answer to this question is one that current research is still working to address. What the inquiry has established is that the materialist framework faces difficulties in accounting for some specific features of the documented phenomena, particularly the perceptions of resuscitation environments that patients should not have been able to perceive given their physical state, and the long-term transformative effects that follow near-death experiences in ways that ordinary hallucinations do not produce. The materialist framework can offer responses to these specific challenges, but the responses involve auxiliary hypotheses whose plausibility is the subject of ongoing scientific debate. The position that consciousness simply ceases at biological death is not the established scientific consensus that some popular accounts have presented it as. The position is one available framework among several, with serious empirical and philosophical objections that current research has not resolved. The second objection focuses on the speculative status of the quantum theories of consciousness that we have considered in earlier stages of the inquiry. The Penrose-Hameroff-Orch-OR theory, despite the recent empirical findings about anesthetic action on microtubules, remains a contested theory rather than an established account of consciousness. The criticisms by Tegmark and others, while substantially weakened by the discovery of biological quantum coherence, have not been definitively refuted. The application of holographic principles to questions about consciousness preservation remains theoretical rather than empirically established. The honest acknowledgement is that the quantum theories provide frameworks within which the questions about consciousness at death can be formulated with greater precision, but the theories do not by themselves establish that consciousness is preserved across biological death. What the theories establish is that the standard materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics rule out any continuation of consciousness across death, is not actually supported by current physics. The principles of physics, properly understood, are consistent with the preservation of consciousness across biological death through mechanisms that current research is working to characterize. But the consistency is not equivalent to demonstration, and the strongest claims that can responsibly be made on the basis of current physics are claims about possibility rather than about actuality. The third objection focuses on the convergence claim that has structured the inquiry. The structural parallels between the contemporary research and the contemplative traditions are real, as we have argued in detail, but the temptation to overstate these parallels is a real intellectual danger that has to be acknowledged. The contemplative traditions did not anticipate the specific neurological findings about gamma wave surges in dying brains. The traditions did not predict the specific mathematical structure of the holographic principle. The traditions worked within their own theological and philosophical frameworks, with their own methods and their own purposes, and their insights stand on their own terms within those frameworks. The contemporary research, similarly, did not arise from contemplative reflection, but from sustained empirical investigation guided by mathematical theory. The two bodies of inquiry stand on their own terms, and the structural parallels between them, however real, do not collapse the distinctions between what each kind of inquiry has actually accomplished. The convergence is real at the level of structural recognition. The convergence is not equivalence at the level of detailed claims. The integrity of each kind of inquiry has to be preserved, and the parallels between them should be observed without being forced into a tighter relationship than they actually warrant. The fourth objection focuses on the popular abuse of the inquiry's themes in contemporary spiritual literature. The recognition that consciousness may persist across biological death has been seized upon by various popularizers to develop frameworks that exceed what either the science or the traditions actually support. The claims that include specific predictions about what individual persons will experience after death. The claims that include guarantees about reunion with deceased loved ones. The claims that include specific spiritual technologies for navigating the post-mortem journey based on partial readings of the contemplative traditions are all distortions of what careful inquiry has actually established. The contemplative traditions did teach that consciousness persists, but they taught this within frameworks of moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The contemporary research has documented phenomena that resist materialist explanation, but the research has not established the specific narratives that the popular literature has constructed. The honest engagement with these questions requires distinguishing what has actually been established from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. The fifth objection concerns the practical danger of false consolation. The recognition that consciousness may persist across biological death can become a way of avoiding the seriousness of mortality rather than engaging it. The materialist tradition has been correct in one important respect, that the avoidance of death through false reassurance is itself a kind of failure to engage with what biological existence actually involves. The contemplative traditions, in their genuine forms, have always emphasized that the recognition of consciousness's persistence does not diminish the seriousness of biological death, but rather places that seriousness within a broader framework. The death is real. The grief of those who remain is real. The transformation that the dying person undergoes is real. The recognition of continuity does not eliminate any of these realities, but situates them within a broader picture in which the realities have meaning beyond what the materialist framework allows. The honest engagement with the inquiry requires holding the recognition of continuity together with the recognition of the genuine reality of death, rather than allowing the former to function as a denial of the latter. The sixth objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Christian doctrine of the resurrection, with its specific claims about the bodily transformation of the deceased and about the eventual completion of cosmic history, is not the same as the Tibetan doctrine of the Bardos, with its specific claims about the sequence of intermediate states and about the eventual rebirth in a new embodied form. The Islamic doctrine of Barzakh, with its specific claims about the conditions of the soul awaiting the Day of Judgment, is not the same as the Hindu doctrine of Atman migration, with its specific claims about the karmic determination of subsequent embodiments. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels, and the engagement requires resisting the temptation to construct a synthetic spiritual framework that combines elements from multiple traditions in ways that none of the traditions themselves would endorse. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The materialist account, in its standard form, faces serious challenges from the documented phenomena of consciousness during cardiac arrest. The quantum theories of consciousness provide frameworks within which the preservation of consciousness across biological death can be formulated with rigor. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of what awaits the consciousness when the biological body ceases. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of science and tradition remain distinct. And the implications for how a person can understand their own approaching death follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that consciousness disappears every night during the deep stages of sleep, only to reconstitute in the morning as the same person who fell asleep, has direct relevance to the question of what happens at biological death. The Quranic identification of sleep and death as structurally parallel processes, articulated in the verse from the 39th surah that we considered earlier, captures a recognition that the contemporary research on consciousness during cardiac arrest has begun to confirm. The mechanism by which consciousness is preserved across the nightly disruption of integrated brain activity is, on the broader picture that is emerging, related to the mechanism by which consciousness might be preserved across the more definitive disruption of biological death. The relationship between the temporary disruption of sleep and the permanent disruption of death is not merely metaphorical. The relationship reflects the deeper structural fact that consciousness has features that exceed the local biological substrate that ordinary perception associates with it, with the temporary and permanent disruptions of that substrate being instances of the more general phenomenon that the inquiry has been examining. The recognition that the cosmos is structured by holographic correspondences, with information at the bulk being preserved on the boundary, even when local bulk configurations are dramatically transformed, provides a framework within which the preservation of consciousness across death can be understood. The deep mathematical work on the ADS, CFT correspondence, the resolution of the black hole information paradox, the broader recognition that information cannot be destroyed in physical systems, all converge on the structural picture in which the dissolution of a local pattern is not the destruction of the information that the pattern was carrying. The human consciousness is, on this broader picture, a pattern that is being carried by a particular biological substrate, but that is itself information whose preservation is governed by the conservation principles that physics has established for analogous systems. The death of the biological substrate is the dissolution of one particular instantiation of the pattern, with the information that the pattern was carrying being preserved through the kinds of mechanisms that the broader physics has identified. The recognition that quantum entanglement establishes non-local correlations that cannot be explained by any local mechanism has its own implications for the questions about death. The consciousness that is currently being, you may be, on the broader picture that contemporary research has begun to document, entangled with broader physical structures that exceed the local biological tissue that ordinary perception associates with the consciousness. The death of the local biological tissue may not be the death of the entangled consciousness, but only the cessation of one particular embodied form through which the entangled consciousness had been manifesting. The relationship between the persisting entangled structure and any continuing subjective experience is one of the open questions that current research is working to address. But the framework within which this question can be formulated is the framework of established quantum physics rather than of speculative metaphysics. The recognition that the cosmos is the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric reality, that you are the residue of broken cosmic symmetry whose specific configuration is the consequence of the asymmetries that allowed surviving matter to come into existence, places the question of individual death within the broader context of cosmic structure. Your existence as a particular configuration of matter is itself the consequence of cosmic processes that selected for the survival of specific patterns. The death of your particular configuration is not the elimination of the broader processes that produce the configuration. The processes continue, with the specific patterns that they produce being preserved through the mechanisms that the broader physics has been documenting. You are part of a cosmic process that exceeds your individual existence, and the death of your individual existence is one transition within the broader process, rather than the termination of anything that the process is fundamentally accomplishing. The recognition that consciousness may have features that resist reduction to any specific physical substrate, that the proto-panpsychist position articulated by Strawson and others may be closer to the truth than the standard materialist framework allows, situates the question of individual death within the broader question of what consciousness fundamentally is. If consciousness is, in some form however attenuated, present at the most basic level of physical reality, then the death of a particular biological configuration is not the elimination of consciousness from the universe, but the cessation of one particular configuration through which consciousness had been manifesting. The broader consciousness that was being configured by the particular biological substrate persists, with the specific subjective experience that was associated with the configuration being part of what dissolves, rather than the entirety of what the consciousness fundamentally was. The recognition that the universe itself may be structured by mirroring at every level, with the manifest cosmos being the imperfect reflection of a deeper symmetric reality, provides additional context for understanding what individual death involves. The mirror that the broader physics has identified, the structural feature by which information at one level is reflected at other levels through the holographic correspondences that the cosmos has been documenting, applies to the relationship between the local biological configuration that constitutes a particular consciousness and the broader structures within which the configuration exists. Your consciousness, on this broader picture, is not strictly localized to the biological tissue that ordinary perception associates with it. Your consciousness is reflected in the broader structures of the cosmos through the same kinds of mirroring relationships that the broader physics has identified throughout the manifest world. The death of the local biological configuration does not eliminate the broader reflections, with the relationship between the local configuration and the broader reflections being one of the features that the inquiry has been working to articulate. The recognition that the cosmos contains vast structures whose organization resembles, in significant respects, the structures of biological neural networks, with patterns of connection and activity that suggest something like cosmic-scale information processing, places individual consciousness within a context that exceeds what any single embodied existence can contain. The neural-like structures of cosmic organization, if the broader recognition holds, would be themselves part of the broader processes within which individual consciousnesses are embedded. The death of a particular individual consciousness is, on this broader picture, not the elimination of the consciousness from the cosmos, but the transition of the consciousness from one particular form of embedded existence into another form, whose features the inquiry has been working to characterize. What this means for the religious and theological dimensions of human experience deserves attention proportional to its weight. The Christian doctrine that the human person is created for eternal communion with God, that the death of the biological body is not the end of the person but the transition to a new mode of existence whose specific features the Christian tradition has worked to characterize, articulates a framework that has substantial structural parallel with what the contemporary research has begun to document. The Pauline distinction between the natural body and the spiritual body, the Augustinian recognition of the soul's continuing existence between death and resurrection, the Eastern Orthodox doctrine of theosis as the gradual transformation that begins in embodied life and continues beyond it, all articulate in the specific theological vocabulary of Christianity, recognitions that have parallel articulations in the contemporary research and in the other contemplative traditions. The convergence is not equivalence, but the convergence is real, and the Christian articulation of these recognitions deserves to be taken seriously as one of the most fully developed frameworks within which the questions about death have been engaged across 2,000 years of sustained reflection. The Tibetan doctrine of the bardos, with its detailed phenomenological characterization of the dying process and the post-mortem journey, articulates with particular precision what the contemporary near-death research has documented in its own different vocabulary. The dissolution of elements that the Bardo Thodol describes corresponds to the physiological cascades that contemporary medicine has documented during the dying process. The encounter with the clear light at the moment of death corresponds to the experiences of luminosity that near-death experiencers consistently report. The encounter with peaceful and wrathful deities, when understood in the proper context as projections of the consciousness's own contents rather than as encounters with external beings, corresponds to the structured experiential content that near-death experiencers describe. The Tibetan tradition has provided, across more than 1,000 years of contemplative investigation, what may be the most detailed and accurate phenomenological account of what happens at death that any tradition has produced. The contemporary research is now in a position to engage this tradition with the seriousness it deserves, and the engagement has begun to produce convergent recognitions that exceed what either inquiry could establish on its own. The Islamic doctrine of barzakh, with its emphasis on the conditions of the soul during the period between biological death and resurrection, contributes its own recognition to the convergent picture. The recognition that the soul's experiences during this period are determined by the dispositions cultivated during embodied life, that the period is one of conscious experience rather than unconscious waiting, that the experiences are real and consequential for the eventual outcome, articulates what the Christian, Tibetan, and Hindu traditions have also recognized in their own different vocabularies. The Sufi practice of dying before dying, the cultivation of conscious engagement with the dying process during embodied life as preparation for the more definitive transition that biological death involves, articulates a practical framework that the various contemplative traditions have developed in their own forms. The convergence on this practical recognition that the dying process can and should be engaged consciously while still embodied, rather than simply awaited as something that will happen to one passively at the end, is one of the most consistent practical recommendations that the traditions have offered. The Hindu doctrine of Atman migration, with its specific account of how the deepest self moves from one embodied form to another across multiple lifetimes, articulates a framework in which biological death is not the end of personal existence, but a transition within a longer process of spiritual development. The framework has substantial parallels with the Tibetan doctrine of rebirth, and the two traditions share specific features that suggest historical and conceptual relationships. The framework differs significantly from the Christian and Islamic frameworks, which emphasize a single embodied life followed by an eternal post-mortem state, and the differences are not surface features that can be dissolved through synthetic interpretation. The differences reflect substantively different commitments about the structure of human existence, and the engagement with the framework requires acknowledging these substantive differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels with what the other traditions and the contemporary research have documented. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of the inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to the fact of mortality than the relationship that the standard materialist framework or the standard avoidance of death allows. The traditions have all developed practices that involve conscious engagement with the dying process, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as ways of bringing the recognition of mortality into the lived experience of religious practitioners. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of engagement, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is the regular contemplation of mortality itself. Most of us avoid thinking about our own deaths, treating the topic as morbid or depressing. The traditions have all recognized that this avoidance is itself a kind of failure to engage with what biological existence actually involves. The Buddhist practice of contemplating the stages of bodily decomposition, the Christian practice of memento mori, the Islamic practice of regular reflection on the certainty of death, the Hindu practice of meditating on the impermanence of all conditioned existence, are all forms of the same basic recognition. The practice is to bring brief but regular attention to the fact that you will die, that the body that you currently inhabit will at some specific moment cease to function, and that the conditions of your existence will be radically transformed. The practice is not morbid when it is done correctly. The practice is the recognition of what is actually true, and the recognition has the effect of clarifying what matters in the embodied life that you currently have. A second practice draws on the Sufi recognition of the smaller death that can be cultivated during embodied life. The practice involves the regular cultivation of conscious release from the patterns of identification and attachment that structure ordinary, embodied existence. Each evening, as you fall asleep, you can practice the conscious release of the day's identifications, the patterns of self-concept that have organized your activities and your relationships. The release is a small death, a daily preparation for the larger transition that will eventually come. The practice does not require any specific religious commitment. The practice requires only the willingness to attend, briefly and consciously, to the patterns of identification that you have been carrying through the day, and to release them as you move toward the unconsciousness of sleep. The practice over time accumulates into a different relationship with the deeper self that exceeds the daily identifications, with the relationship being the foundation for engaging the eventual biological death from a position of cultivated freedom rather than of unprepared resistance. A third practice involves the conscious engagement with the deaths of others. The traditions have all recognized that the deaths of those around us are opportunities for engagement with the dying process while still embodied. The Christian tradition of accompanying the dying through prayer and presence, the Tibetan tradition of guiding the dying through the bardo states with the recitation of relevant texts, the Islamic tradition of attending the dying with the recitation of the Shahada, the Hindu tradition of supporting the dying with the chanting of sacred names, are all forms of the same basic recognition. The presence with someone who is dying is not merely a comfort to the dying person, although it is that. The presence is also an opportunity for the one who accompanies to engage consciously with the dying process, to attend to what is happening with the same seriousness that the contemplative traditions have brought to their own philosophical reflections, and to integrate the recognition of mortality into the embodied life that continues after the death of the other has occurred. A fourth practice involves the cultivation of what might be called the longer perspective on the present moment. The recognition that you are going to die can be a way of bringing greater attention to the moments of embodied existence that you currently have, with the recognition that these moments are not infinite, and that the time available for inhabiting them with awareness is limited. The practice does not require any specific religious commitment. The practice requires only the willingness to allow the recognition of mortality to inform how you engage with the present moment, with the engagement being deeper because the moment is recognized as one of a limited number rather than as one of an indefinite supply. The practice has been articulated in various forms across the contemplative traditions, and the convergence of the traditions on this practical recommendation is itself one of the structural features of what the traditions are pointing toward. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the embodied existence that you currently have and the death that lies ahead. The death becomes less an event that you avoid contemplating and more a feature of the broader structure within which your embodied existence unfolds. The contemplation of mortality becomes less a morbid intrusion into ordinary life and more a continuous awareness that informs and deepens ordinary life. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with the structural feature of human existence that the contemplative traditions have placed at the center of their inquiries, and that contemporary research is now in a position to engage with the seriousness it deserves. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition that the consciousness that is currently constituting your experience is not eliminated when the biological body that has been carrying it ceases to function. A recognition that the cessation is a transformation rather than an elimination, with the specific form of the transformation being characterized by the contemplative traditions and engaged by contemporary research from their own different angles. A recognition that the engagement with the fact of mortality is one of the central concerns of conscious existence, that the engagement can be cultivated through practices that the traditions have developed across thousands of years, and that the cultivation has effects on the embodied life that you currently have. The question of what specifically awaits you on the other side of biological death is a question that no current investigation can answer with full certainty. The question of how you can inhabit your remaining embodied existence in light of the recognitions that the inquiry has pointed toward is a question that you are in a position to answer through the choices you make and the practices you cultivate. The body that reads these words will die. The biological substrate that is currently carrying your consciousness will at some specific moment cease to function. The information that constitutes you, the specific patterns that encode your memories and your sense of self, and the awareness that is currently engaging these words, will be transformed through mechanisms that the inquiry has been working to characterize. The transformation will not be elimination. The mechanisms that physics has established for the conservation of information through transformations of physical systems apply to the information that constitutes you with the same rigor that they apply to any other physical pattern. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, the specific features that the transformation involves. The contemporary research is now in a position to engage these articulations with the seriousness they deserve, and the engagement is producing convergent recognitions that exceed what either inquiry could establish on its own. You are not what dies. The biological body that reads these words is not the totality of what you are. The transformation that biological death involves is not the cessation of you, but the transition of you into a different mode of existence whose specific features the inquiry has worked to characterize. The fear that ordinary perception carries about biological death rests on the assumption that the death is the elimination of you. The recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward is that this assumption is, while accurate at one level, not the deepest fact about what death actually involves. The death is a transformation. The transformation preserves what you most fundamentally are, while transforming the specific configuration through which you have been manifesting. And your specific position as the consciousness that is currently inhabiting a particular biological body, asking these questions in this particular moment of your existence, is one stage within a longer process whose features extend beyond what the embodied life can encompass. When the moment comes, when the biological substrate that has been carrying your consciousness ceases to function, the recognitions that the inquiry has examined will not be available to you as theoretical frameworks for analysis. The recognitions will be available, if they are available at all, as the cultivated background that has informed your engagement with embodied existence across the years that preceded the moment. The cultivation matters, the practices matter. The recognition that you are not what dies is not a recognition that produces its effects through mere intellectual assent. The recognition produces its effects through the gradual transformation of the relationship between the conscious self and the structures of embodied existence that the recognition allows to take shape across the years of cultivation. The question is not whether you will die. The question is what kind of relationship you will have cultivated with the fact of your own mortality when the moment arrives. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that this relationship is the central concern of conscious existence, more central than any of the other concerns that ordinarily occupy the embodied life. The contemporary research is beginning to recognize the same thing in its own different vocabulary, and the recognition is available to you now in this moment of reading, with the practices that the traditions have developed and that the research has begun to confirm, as the resources for the cultivation that the rest of your embodied existence will be the time for accomplishing. You are going to die, not eventually, in some abstract future. The configuration of matter that you call yourself is moving toward dissolution at every moment, and the dissolution is unfolding in your tissues right now. But the dissolution is not the elimination of you. The dissolution is the transformation of you into a mode of existence whose features have been the subject of careful inquiry across multiple traditions and across contemporary research that has begun to engage these questions with the seriousness they deserve. The transformation will preserve what you most fundamentally are. The transformation will transform what you have been taking yourself to be. And the relationship between what is preserved and what is transformed is the relationship that the rest of your embodied existence will be the time for understanding, with the understanding being not a matter of intellectual analysis, but of the cultivated relationship that the practices, the traditions have developed, allow to take shape across the years that remain. You have time. The time is finite, and what you do with the time is the most consequential choice that any conscious being can make.